So in my research and looking at how activists contest authoritarian states and combat violence and oppression and censorship in the places that they live, for example, when I did field work in the Kingdom of Jordan in 2011, to understand how activists there were mobilizing against state surveillance and repression and getting beat up when they would go to protest. What I discovered is that a lot of the activism that we assume to be local or domestic or taking place somewhere else is actually transnational in character. And what I mean by that is activists often rely on gaining the attention of international audiences and external allies like social movements in the US or Human Rights Watch or the United Nations in order to gain leverage to contest the state and to push for their grievances. So if they go to a protest and they start to get beat up or hurt and they take cell phone video footage of that happening, they use their outside connections, as I mentioned, with media, human rights groups, social movements, other activists. They send them that footage and they say, hey, help us get the word out. Help us let people know that this is going on. And that's incredibly important in places that often don't get a lot of media coverage, where the state is highly or fairly repressive and is constantly going back on its word in terms of protecting rights and civil liberties, or it doesn't enforce rights or civil liberties at all. And it's sometimes the only way that activists have to gain leverage against their opponents in these contexts, as these international cross-border connections that they have with other like-minded movements, activists, and institutions. So that said, activists and social movements who reside in relatively privileged places, like the United States, like South Africa, Japan, Great Britain, you name it, they can do a lot to help social movements that are underway in more repressive contexts. So what often can happen, and I found this that this happened frequently in many cases during the Arab Spring revolutions in 2011, when people would go out to protest for their rights, against corruption, for bread, for basic things, and regimes in places like Libya and Syria would shoot them. They were not allowed to protest at all. What happened was activists there were very much reliant on allies in, for example, in the diaspora, in the Libyan and Syrian diaspora, among folks who were living in places like New York or London. They would send them videos of what was going on, and particularly because there was no free press, there were no international journalists there in the beginning to report on these atrocities that were happening. They would send them footage, and then activists on the outside would translate these images or these videos. They would send them to the BBC or CNN. They would alert human rights groups. They would use them as evidence to lobby the United States government or the government of the UK to try to act to do something to help. And this work was critically important because, as I mentioned, activists who are operating in highly repressive contexts, their only hope oftentimes of pressuring their governments to behave is to gain international support, to build international pressure, and to get others on the outside, whether it's the UN or was the administration of Barack Obama or whoever, to pressure these states to stop engaging in such serious and horrific forms of repression. So social movements and activists who are interested in supporting liberal social change efforts in places like the Middle East and elsewhere, in highly repressive places, can do a lot right from home, right from their computers, to help. And when activists on the outside forge relationships and connections with activists under siege who are facing extreme censorship, bombardment, harassment, you name it, they can often provide a kind of link and a conduit to get information out. That's very important for trying to pressure these regimes into backing off, at the very least. And so social movements on the outside, as I mentioned, can be a very critical lifeline for activists who are trapped in undesirable and highly illiberal conditions. Now, that said, it's fantastic to work to be an ally for causes and for groups that are fighting for their lives, fighting for their rights in other places. But it needs to be done with some care. There can be a tendency, unfortunately, for activists and social movement groups living in more privileged places, and oftentimes the democratic West, as we say, to speak for their allies in non-privileged places, or to speak over their allies there. And a better approach is to work to channel the voices of those folks and those movements out to the international stage, rather than to try to speak for them. And in this way, we can prevent certain groups from misspeaking or speaking over the folks that they're supposedly trying to help, and oftentimes are very well intentioned in trying to help in less advantaged places. Another thing that's important is for activists on the outside to do a little bit of work to understand the complexities of the contention and the fighting and the mobilization that's happening far away. That's important for a number of reasons. The first is that there can be a lot of allies or sympathetic groups mobilizing someplace else, someplace over there. But oftentimes they're not the same. They don't necessarily get along with each other. They might have different principles or different grievances and different ideas about the kinds of change that they want. And they often stand for different things. So we've seen in the Syrian revolution, for example, is a good example, a lot of different kinds of groups united in their opposition to the totalitarian style regime of Bashar al-Assad, but very, very different in the kinds of tactics that they use, in the kinds of ideas that they put forth, in the kinds of people that they have recruited, and the kinds of ethnic backgrounds and religious backgrounds of those groups. Some of the folks mobilizing in the Syrian revolution are secular, are anarchists, are nonviolent, are engaged in civil disobedience and have been. So understanding the array of actors on the ground and how they're not all one is very important for us to be able to begin to help or support those efforts from afar. While we can do a lot from our computers or from our city centers in relatively safe and privileged places, it's at all times important to understand that the activists who are mobilizing in places like Syria, Yemen, the Philippines, Russia, so many right now, are taking extreme risks to do very simple things, or things that we think are simple, things that we consider to be normal, like taking a cell phone video, posting a critical stance against the government on Facebook, going out in the street and holding a sign on the sidewalk that says, "We want something different." The kinds of risks in general that we face in terms of expressing our basic grievances and our demands for human rights is very, very different depending on who you are and where you are. So it's important for us to understand that and to act appropriately in terms of making sure that we don't accidentally hurt the people overseas who are taking big risks, exposing them in any way, really taking the cues from them about what they need in order for us to be the most helpful rather than accidentally or potentially hurtful.